So we'll come back to where we were. As I said, we're kind of heading now through from Perea to going to cross the River Jordan, heading towards Jericho. And in that period, Jesus makes a third prediction of his resurrection. So I've kind of highlighted he's predicted it very explicitly after Peter's confession, if you remember when they're up in Hermon. Which really, Mount Hermon kind of marks the point where Jesus starts moving south. Obviously, he goes through Galilee going south, but ever since Mount Hermon, Jesus was kind of heading south, heading south, heading south. He got south and he came up north a bit, but he never goes quite as north. So he's kind of in this final spiral. And then actually on the road to Capernaum, after they've left Mount Hermon, just before they get to Capernaum, there's a second time when Jesus has told them, his disciples explicitly, about his death and resurrection. And now this third time, so Jesus took the 12 aside and said to them, look, we're going up to Jerusalem. And you think, why does he have to tell them 3 times? You see, as we get to the end, and everything that's written about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished. He'll be handed over to the Gentiles. He'll be mocked, mistreated, and spat on. They'll flog him severely and kill him. Yet on the third day, he will rise again. And it says, but the 12 understood none of these things, saying this saying was hidden from them, and they didn't grasp what Jesus meant. So there's obviously a bit of kind of deliberate spiritual blindness. I've highlighted the on the third day he will rise again, and it's just one of those little tensions that you get because you'll meet folks and they'll make a big thing because Jesus talks about 3 days and 3 nights when he talks about Jonah and the sign of Jonah and being in the belly of the whale 3 days and 3 nights. And so they say, so therefore, actually, Jesus must have been crucified an extra day ahead, and we've just somehow lost that day. But then that would contradict here, being on the third day he will rise again. The thing I would say is that the 3 days and 3 nights is a kind of what we call an idiom. It's an idiom doesn't have to be taken 100% precisely. In a strange way, we use the word fortnight like that. If I say I'll see you in a fortnight and I see you in 15 days, nobody complains. Does that make sense? It's an idiom that kind of means roughly this. Whereas here, Jesus doesn't use an idiom because there's nothing natty. 3 days and 3 nights is kind of poetic. He just says it will be on the third day that he will rise again. So here Jesus is being explicit rather than using an idiom. So there's not Muslims make a big thing about this. They say it's a contradiction. I'm just saying, And the point is, people who speak normal language do things all the time. We talk about people being 6 foot under, which just doesn't mean that actually the grave diggers actually worked out to the inch that it's 6 foot. It's just a kind of an idiom that means they're dead and buried. 3 days and 3 nights is a kind of an idiom for death. It's kind of a phrase, they really are dead. They're fully gone. So Jesus uses that in that context. Here he's more explicit and it's more precise. It will be on the third day that he rises. And yes, it really is on the third day. But despite that, despite Jesus being really kind of straightforward and specific in the way he speaks and what he says about it, they don't really grasp what Jesus meant. Oh, I know why. Okay, I'll go there. Now it will work. There we go. And this is the point we touched on earlier, where then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to him and she asked him for a favour. Permit that these 2 sons of mine sit, one on your right hand and one on your left in the kingdom. And Jesus answered, do you know what you're asking? This is now addressing James and John. Are you able to drink the cup I'm about to drink? And they said, yes, we are. We are able. He told them, you will drink the cup. Of course, James famously is the first of the apostles to be martyred. So he really does drink that cup. John, of course, dies in pain in exile, but he doesn't martyred. But they say yes. He says, yeah, okay, you will drink it, but it's not for you to. It's not for me to give the right and left. That's for whom it's been prepared by my Father. And just kind of highlighting Salome, the mother of James and John. At the cross, we read these 3 lists, and it's just in case you've not seen it before. We'll look at it when we do the run through next time. There are 3 lists of the women at the cross. And so and if you match them, you can see why it is that Salome seems to be the mother of James and John. And when I say seems, I always leave a 5% because there are other ways. The most obvious reading is that she is the mother of James and John is Salome, who is Mary's sister. But you can always imagine a scenario where they're 2 separate people, and it's just that they didn't list them all. That's the other way of looking at it. So in Matthew, we read that at the cross, there's Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. So I've highlighted that one. In Mark's Gospel, we read at the cross, there's Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Less and Joses, which is same as James and Joseph. It's just a different way of turning Joseph into a Greek name. And Salome, so Salome in place of the sons of the mother of the sons of Zebedee. And then in John's Gospel, we read that at the cross there is Mary Magdalene, Mary the wife of Clopas. So presumably the wife of Clopas is Mary the mother of James the Less and Joseph, or does that make sense? And his mother's sister. So here the third person has become his mother's sister. So Salome is Mary, the mother of Jesus' sister. She's also the mother of James and John. So that means that James and John are Jesus' cousins. It also means that James the Less, although it doesn't actually, we can't see it here, but we're told that Clopas is the disciple who is on the road to Emmaus, if you remember. So Mary, the mother of Clopas, although sometimes he's called Cleopas, which is a proper Greek name, but Clopas is actually a Greek way of saying the Aramaic name life.I, which sometimes gets translated into Greek as Alphaeus, and you sometimes will see that name in the New Testament too. But it's the same person. So we have this same kind of mix. So Salome, the mother of James and John, seems to be Jesus' aunt, which makes sense, as we've talked on this before, why she feels free to kind of suggest to Jesus that actually her brothers, her boys, should be sitting on either side, because yes, he's got brothers, but they haven't followed. He's got cousins, James and John, and not only has he got cousins, but they've been followers of Jesus, and not only that, but they've been quite significant ones, because there are times when it's Peter, James, and John, if you remember, those three. So they're really up there and close to Jesus. So it's not an unreasonable, on the face of it, kind of thing for an aunt to do, to say. But Jesus he rejects that sort of nepotistic entitlement at that point, and just as it's not for him to choose in those ways. But I raised this kind of question. So it's mid-March about now, which means we're getting very close to the pilgrim period running up to Jerusalem. And here we suddenly have Salome, the mother of two of the disciples, on the road with them. And so it raises the question, are Jesus' family joining him on the journey to Jerusalem? They're probably a slow trickle. It will kind of crescendo. Some people want to get to Jerusalem a bit ahead of the festival, because if you're going to find the right place to stay and so on. So there's probably a slowly growing kind of mass of people who are beginning to head towards Jerusalem. In about a week's time, they're going to head down themselves directly from Jericho. And we're in this kind of final week before actually we start that last ever leg and last journey. So I'm just kind of raising it. It's possible, therefore, that the family is joining Jesus in the kind of pilgrim crowds. So I put that little note. So during Passover week itself, and actually when Jesus is being arrested, John goes and he actually is able to round up members of the family. So he rounds up Jesus' mother Mary, his uncle Clopas, and his wife Mary, who's therefore uncle and aunt, and their parents of James and Less. He also finds Salome. We're told by the early church that the other disciple on the road is Simon, who is another cousin of Jesus, a child of Clopas. So John seems to be able to round up the family. And it's therefore not unreasonable to imagine, in this kind of only a handful of days before Passover is going to start at this stage, we're heading there before Passover week starts, that actually they're beginning to connect as they're heading down. Word is kind of running up, because they're traveling probably now along the main pilgrim route, which runs down the Jordan and across to Jericho. So they're on that route, and probably word of where Jesus is and as the crowds are going, and probably going backwards and forwards. And so somehow you can imagine the family beginning to connect up. So in that context, after saying those things, the other 10 disciples hear it and they get angry with the two brothers. And so Jesus teaches them about humility and service. Says, that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Those in high positions use their authority. It's not going to be that way among you. If you want to be great, you've got to be a servant. Whoever wants to be first must become a slave. So just as the Son of Man didn't come to serve, but to be served and give his life as a ransom for many. And that little phrase, give his life a ransom to many, of course, becomes one of our idioms, isn't it? That Jesus, who gave his life as a ransom for many. And even that word captures something of the way in which the price is being paid. I don't know why my computer. It's singing, isn't it? It's plugged in. But who knows? Okay, there we go. Oh, you know what? I bet you're not happy. I'm on Skype broadcasting. I bet somebody's trying to talk to me now. They probably noticed I'm on there, so I'm misting boring. Shh, be quiet. Yeah, that's right. Um, Now, just outside Jericho, they've come across Bartimaeus and his friend. So as Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the road begging. So he called out, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." And those who were in front scolded him to get him to be quiet. But he shouted even more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." So Jesus stopped and ordered the beggar to be brought to him. And the man came. You know the story. "What do you want?" He replied, "Lord, let me see again." And Jesus said, "Receive your sight. Your faith has healed you." Immediately, so there's no washing in the pool of Siloam this time. It's just immediately he regained his sight and followed Jesus. And the people saw it, they gave praise to God. Now the thing is, if we look at the next little slide, there are some discrepancies, and I put them in brackets, the word discrepancies, because we just have to resolve them. It's the kind of key in the three gospel accounts. So I've kind of highlighted them. So in Luke, we just read it, as Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the road. If we read it in Matthew's Gospel, he says, as they were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed, and two blind men were sitting by the road. So we've gone from approaching Jericho to leaving Jericho, from one blind man to two blind men. And they came to Jericho as Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving. So here we've had in Mark both coming and going. They come to Jericho, they leave. As they're leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, the blind beggar. So we now know that the blind beggar has a real name. As we picked up in analysis of kind of this kind of classical literature, where someone is named in this kind of way in a history, it normally means that they are available to talk to. So Mark is kind of naming him because he's someone that's probably part of the early church community that people can know and can go verify this story with. So now how do we resolve these things? So reading on in Luke, if we go on, it kind of implies that Jesus is staying near Jericho before he really sets out for Jerusalem proper. So in that kind of sense, you can see it's not kind of complicated to see that actually in that way, and we actually pick that up in Mark's Gospels. They come into Jericho and they're leaving Jericho. And then, so it really comes down to, if you're describing as an eyewitness, and Jesus is passing through, but actually he's looping a couple of times because he's staying there for a day or so just outside. Probably not staying in the town because he's got a large crowd, probably therefore out in the kind of the pilgrim areas. And in that process, therefore, you're kind of coming in and out for a couple of days. Does that make sense? So it just depends a little bit how you want to describe it. It appears at the beginning of that process, as Jesus is approaching, technically he's actually gone into the town and is kind of leaving for the first night. So technically he's leaving, but he's not leaving Jericho for good. He's just leaving the town. And then he sees two men by the road. And we end up knowing one of their names because he becomes a member of the church. And that one member is the one that when Luke writes his gospel, he's focused on. So there are two blind men. Matthew's telling us that. Mark tells us the name of one because he's available and knowable. By the time Luke is telling the story, people know about blind Bartimaeus. He doesn't bother to name him, but they only know of one person. So he just leaves it as one. So can you see how the kind of the stories blend together into that?
Is there also
full
a question
picture?
of, these guys are crying out all day long, so he's turning and throwing or have you. You tend to think the events are immediate, but in fact, if it's stretched over a day, and he's crying out, "Son of David."
Oh, I see. Yeah. While he comes in and I get what you're saying.
So in other words, basically,
so
he tend
he
to think it's happened straight away.
Yeah.
He doesn't. It's not a discrepancy. He's there all the time.
He's there.
crying
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, but basically, and the solution is the same idea, which is there's a process around Jericho going on, and what we're going to see, of course, is Jesus is having a meal then the next day with Zacchaeus. So he's kind of really, which is what we're driving at, is that there's a bit of a process around Jericho, which means that in that process you could call it coming or you can call it going. It's all part of the same flow. So we move on. And so now he enters Jericho. So he's come, he's left, and he's gone back in. You see, we've got that purely from Luke.
There's a bit where it says, those who led the way rebuked him. So they were in the front of the entourage.
Yeah.
So there's a whole lot of people going. So I don't see a real discrepancy. he seems to be crying out all day long, whatever. Over at the front, Jesus is somewhere down the procession.
No, which is why I put it in brackets.
Yeah.
I mean, quotes. The reason for flagging it though is those kind of things get cited at you. Because there are atheist websites out there that have lists of these things, you know, and when you just get them thrown at you verse after verse, and you don't know the context, they can throw people. That's why they do them. So I just flag them as we go through, and just kind of explain, highlight why we need to think about them. So Jesus was passing through it, and a man named Zacchaeus was there. He was a chief tax collector and was rich, and he was trying to get a look at Jesus. But because he's a short man, he couldn't see over the crowd, so he ran ahead, climbed up the sycamore tree, and gives us one of those memorable stories that I remember learning in Sunday school. For some reason, we all learned that it was a sycamore tree. Do you remember that? You know, I was going to say most of my life I didn't used to bother what kind of trees they were unless they were conker trees. They were the only trees I cared about as a kid. But we all knew about sycamore trees because Zacchaeus climbed up one. So Jesus came to that place. He looked out and says, "Come down." And here again, we got this kind of context, which seems to be part of the flow between those who are religious but actually whose hearts sometimes are far from the Lord, and those who have been made a mess of things but actually are very keen and eager. And so Zacchaeus stopped and said to the Lord, Lord, half my possessions I'm now going to give to the poor. So it's this huge kind of conversion. If I've cheated anyone of anything, I'm going to pay back 4 times as much. So Jesus says, today salvation has come to this household, which is a really fun. This is the kind of the closing moment before we actually meet Jesus in Jerusalem. There's this kind of wonderful moment. Behold, salvation has come to this household. He too is the son of Abraham, for the Son of Man has come to seek and save the lost. And in many ways, that's been kind of this ongoing theme of this thing, is something about the grace and the expansiveness of the way Jesus operates, that has not abandoned the law, but he has shown it in a new light. He's shown it in a more kind of promissory, transformational kind of a way, and he's addressed it in a way that is more invitational. And again, you know, that tension and that balance is one all the time that you find playing out in church. We tend to, you know, I often say it's like with riding a bike. When you're riding, it's fine. As soon as you stop, you fall one way or the other. And so we fall either into kind of legalism or into kind of license. And Jesus somehow gets this wonderful balance, which is neither. You know, it's somehow the two are held in balance, which is that I'm aspiring and becoming something, even if I fail and I trip along the way. Is the kind of the.
Is the 4 times as much? Is that the old covenant?
Yes, yeah. For like if you accidentally.
So Zacchaeus is responding according to the law.
Yeah.
And Jesus is coming into the new covenant, the grace.
He's coming by grace. Yeah. Yes, so he's there is a sense of it. Yeah, so he's not actually abandoning his Judaism either. He's kind of saying, actually, this is what
it's fulfilling it.
It's fulfilling it. Yeah, yeah, that's a good point there. Good point, Howard. And the other thing to flag though is if I've cheated anyone of anything. So he is as a tax collector, he is allowed to charge beyond what he collects because that's how he gets paid. So the issue isn't everything that he's ever collected and everything he's ever earned. It's much more what he's been unreasonable about, where he's used kind of the power and leverage to kind of actually extort from those who are weaker probably and in difficult situations that he's making reparation for. So, and it's in that context, therefore, that then Jesus tells us the story of the 10 minas. Or minas, I never know how to say these things. And he tells the story. It's actually kind of 2 stories kind of wrapped together, if you've noticed it. You know, the one bit is about he leaves 3 people with some money, and 2 of them invest and 1 doesn't. You know, and 2 of them give a return and 1 doesn't, which is not dissimilar to the parable of the talents. But in the parable of the talents, and so sometimes people say, oh, it was 1 story, but actually they're very, very different in their contexts and so on. There are some very distinctive differences, and what we're going to see is actually there is actually a 3rd story, but we've lost it from the Gospels, but we have it reported to us by the early church. So Jesus obviously regularly told stories about people who left money to be invested, if that makes sense. But he's doing it in different kind of contexts. And there's a kind of context here. So he says a nobleman went to a distant country to receive for himself a kingdom and then return. So Luke's setting actually kind of parallels what happens to Herod Archelaus. who used to rule Judea, but he lost it because he was such a bad king, and now Pilate was put in place by the Romans. But Herod Archelaus went to Rome because the Romans wouldn't agree to Herod's will until they all came up to Rome. Remember, he divides his kingdom into 4 parts. So he goes up to Rome to receive a kingdom in 4 BC. Everybody remembers this. I mean, this is right, of course, when Jesus is being born, so it's not a new story. But it does seem very clearly, as you'll see, that Jesus is likening it to him. And his citizens hated him and sent a delegation after him, saying, "We don't want this man to be a king over us." So Josephus actually tells us that they sent an envoy to Augustus while Archelaus is still traveling. So by the time he gets there, this delegation has already got there, who come complaining, saying that they don't want Archelaus to be their king. But Caesar ignores that anyway, and Archelaus gets it. And so then right at the end of the parable, Jesus says, "But as for these enemies of mine," this is the man speaking, "who did not want me to be their king, bring them here and slaughter them in front of me." In actual fact, Archelaus comes back, rounds them all up in the temple, and kills 3,000 of them. So there is a very real context, and sometimes it's worth noting that because I remember again on one of these kind of these atheist websites where they were making out that somehow that God was the king in this story, you see, which is just stupid because they obviously haven't read they don't know any history, because there's no way in which this ruler is just kind of standing in the place of God. If you know what I mean, that actually what Jesus is doing is he's telling a story about taking risk and so on. And it is a story, and he is colouring it with things that they all relate to. And the expectations of violent kings and the things that go on with violent kings. So it's helpful to kind of see that the history behind it, because it reminds us very clearly that the king is not the king, but the man who goes off to receive the kingdom is not just Jesus, if that makes sense. Because Jesus clearly goes away and receives his kingdom as well in a similar sense. But actually we have this, the one that he's telling the story about is one that really happens in history. He's dropping the hint of that idea of someone when they're not around doesn't mean they're not getting a kingdom. That's all. There's an interesting little bit though, as we're coming to the end, the final comment. As I said, that there's Jesus tells the parable of the miners. He also tells the parable of the talents, and there is a third version, which Eusebius tells us. Unfortunately, he paraphrases it, so we don't have the full version, which was written up in what he calls a Hebrew gospel. And we have many references in the early church fathers, and I put there that could be therefore a reference to the first version of Matthew, which was apparently written in Hebrew. Remember, the Nazareans, we know, again, remember we looked at this when we looked at the roots of the Gospels, and we saw there's this very strong tradition that Matthew's Gospel was originally written in Hebrew, and that there were versions of it that kind of multiplied, slight variants, and one of them stayed with the Nazareans. So many modern scholars feel that Eusebius is quoting from that. That unfortunately was lost when Muslims sacked Jerusalem and burnt up lots of the books and Christian documents. So that gospel existed until the 6th or 7th century. It only disappeared at that point. And there is still a hope, people in kind of scholarship, that maybe one day someone will recover it. But we have little snippets of it, including this story. That it seems that while it wasn't as universally accepted as the other 4 Gospels, in certain quarters of the church was being used alongside them. So, and in the other version is very similar to the parable of the talents, but the difference is the one who gets 1 talent hides his 1 talent, and he gets told off. He gets rebuked, told he should have invested it. And the man who receives 2 talents invests them and makes a profit and gets commended. But the man who gets 5 talents in this version, here's the quote exactly as Eusebius puts it: wastes his master's possessions on harlots and flute girls. So, flute girls is just one of those interesting images, but that's the phrase that he uses.
I've heard it before, flute girls.
And flute girls, yeah. So presumably, though, it is part of, like I was saying, this whole thing of travelling and so on. And actually, in this one, it's the 5 talent one who gets sent into outer darkness. Although Eusebius tells us that's actually what that means. It's prison. He's locked into. He's put into prison effectively. So you again, it's not in the gospel, so it's not been saved for us. But I always find it's interesting to kind of think in terms of the way in which Jesus is using a basic idea, the idea of someone going, returning, people for the idea of the fact that there is a kind of periods where it seems like God is absent, and how do we behave in that context, and that probably he's telling this story in multiple ways, and for me it very much fits what I've tended to assume, which is often the teaching we have of Jesus is distilled out of it being delivered multiple times in slightly different contexts. So we often have it recorded in a context, but it probably is the distillation of something Jesus is regularly doing, because he'll sit with a group of 10 people and talk through, and tomorrow there's a different 10, maybe not tomorrow, but you know what I mean, because you can't do 500 at detail. You can do 500 from a hillside in one way, but these other things, they get repeated, replayed, they get nuanced, they get slight variations. So, but you kind of, and that to me makes sense, because as someone who's done a lot of public speaking in life, that's how I do it. So that's why it makes, so that's, I'm not the arbiter of all things truthful, but it just makes sense that you know, I've told I've told testimonies that I've been involved in lots of times. Sometimes you include a person that's not there for some reason, just when I say not there, what I mean is sometimes you tell a story without one person in it, sometimes you add them. It all depends on context and what people want, you know, that kind of what you're trying to get across in that moment. And I just think that as we get to the end of this little section, really, that's one of the things I want to try and get across to folks, is particularly with the teaching as you read them in the Gospels. The teaching as you have it in the Gospels has been delivered day in, day out, walking alongside someone telling a story that he told to Matthew 2 weeks ago, but now you're new and you've not heard this before. So those kind of things are being repeated, and they're being slightly modified because of the context and the relationship, and today there's that going on, so it gets referenced, and so that's why we have these slight variations, but on similar themes, kind of keep repeating their way through. So I think that is end of session 4 here, end of the lesson.